that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now let's get into it. The very nature of my work as an inventor and manufacturer of supportive mechanical prosthetics, specifically tailored for large animals and racehorses, means I am constantly at the mercy of emergency calls in the dead of night. It was the autumn of 1924, a turbulent era following the Great War, during which Germany was desperately struggling to catch its breath. I was in my small workshop on the outskirts of Munich, deeply engrossed in repairing the gears of an old wall clock just to keep sleep at bay, when the sharp, brassy ring of the hand-cranked telephone suddenly shattered the silence. The caller was Frau Elsa von Heller, who, along with her elderly husband Gottfried, managed a renowned horse breeding and training farm situated on the rugged, treacherous mountain path of Walchensee. I held the von Heller family in immense high regard. They had been loyal clients of our workshop since my father's time, back when I was merely a young boy eagerly watching how machines could be crafted to alleviate the suffering of helpless creatures. The couple was in their late 60s, cut from that cloth of resilient Prussian farmers who never uttered a plea for help unless their hearts had leapt into their throats. They were the kind of people who knew how to manage their own affairs through thick and thin. This time, however, things were spiraling into absolute ruin. Their cherished stallion, the oldest on the farm, a venerable sire named Brutus, was drawing his final breaths in his stall due to an acute intestinal torsion, and there was nothing they could do to soothe his excruciating agony. This meant the heavy burden had fallen entirely upon my shoulders to end his misery using my medical methods. The journey to the von Heller farm took nearly an hour and a half through pitch-black darkness, even though it rarely took more than 50 minutes during the day. I drove my old Benz truck with extreme, almost obsessive caution. The rocky mountain roads of Bavaria during that era were literal death traps, especially when engulfed by night. When I finally arrived and veered into the farm's courtyard, a faint curse escaped my lips. The truck's tires sank deep into a thick, sweeping mud that had not been covered with sawdust as was customary. What aroused my suspicion and kind of sparked a fuse of anxiety in my mind, however, was the sight of an old motorcycle with a sidecar idling in the shadows next to the family's vehicles. It was a dilapidated military machine that did not belong there, and no one had mentioned the presence of strangers. In fact, Frau Elsa had assured me that I would find no one but her and her husband in the rear barn. I grabbed my heavy leather bag, designated for veterinary surgery, from the back seat and headed toward the large barn, stumbling through the mud, which nearly ripped my long leather boots off several times. Before my foot could even cross the threshold of the wooden structure, I realized that danger was lurking inside. The massive door was left ajar by more than a few inches, and from the crack emanated a strange voice, sharp, harsh, and dripping with threat, that sounded nothing like Gottfried's gentle tone. I crept forward with caution and peered through a gap in the weathered wooden planks of the barn wall, and what I saw made the blood freeze in my veins. There stood a slender young man, clad in a tattered, old military coat, aiming a Mauser hunting rifle directly at the chests of the elderly couple. I was able to catch almost every single word. The youth, whose name turned out to be Hans, was screaming at them using incredibly cruel and vile phrases, words that would make anyone wince, let alone when directed at one's own parents. Yes, Hans was their wayward son who had vanished 2 years prior. The reason for his late-night intrusion was to force his parents to hand over a sum of 40,000 German marks. Hans made no secret of the fact that this hefty amount was intended to fund his illicit trade in smuggling opium and narcotics, running the operation alongside a partner in the back alleys of Munich. He claimed his partner had provided the lion's share of the capital and that his family had to cough up the rest. Old Gottfried was pleading with him in a trembling voice, trying to make him realize that this partner was deceiving him, that no such real business existed, and that the money would simply vanish into gambling dens and opium pipes. Hans's response was to rack the rifle, threatening to shoot them and take the keys by force. He claimed he knew the exact location of the built-in iron wall safe, stating with chilling coldness that although killing his parents would destroy him psychologically, returning to a neighborhood bankrupt and hunted by creditors would destroy him even more. I knew I did not have the luxury of waiting. I backed away from the gap in the wall and slipped through the opening of the back door, my steps as silent as a ghost. Hans did not notice my presence, nor did Frau Elsa, who was weeping silently. Unfortunately, however, old Gottfried's eyes locked onto mine, and he could not suppress the overwhelming look of relief that washed over his weary face. That fleeting gleam in the old man's eyes was enough to alert the son. Hans spun around with lightning speed, and the long barrel of the rifle was instantly leveled right at my forehead. I froze dead in my tracks, seized by an intense urge to turn back and flee. A firearm had never been pointed at my head before. In my line of work, I had faced rampaging horses that kicked me in the chest, climbed iron fences to escape a pack of vicious wild boars in the Black Forest, and maintained my composure while securing a prosthetic limb onto a circus tiger that awoke prematurely before the anesthesia fully took hold. Yet, none of those things had ever terrified me or robbed me of my courage the way Hans's hollow eyes did. Eyes consumed by madness and the destructive aftermath of addiction. I nearly forgot the reason I was there until I noticed his eyes dart instinctively toward the nearby stall where Brutus lay on his side, whimpering weakly. Without averting his gaze from me entirely, he asked his parents in a tone that suddenly lacked its previous malice, "Is Brutus dying?" In that moment, I remembered, when Hans was a teenager, long before his downward spiral, Brutus had been his personal horse, the companion that had accompanied him across the hills of Bavaria. From behind his shoulder, Frau Elsa confessed with a faint sob, "Yes, my boy, we called the mechanic out on this night to see if he could put an end to his suffering." Here, old Gottfried began to implore his son, asking him if he truly wished for this bloody scene, threatening his parents at gunpoint to be the final memory with which his cherished horse departed this world. For a split second, I thought Hans had completely cast away his humanity, and that the opium obsession had erased every shred of goodness in his heart. But suddenly, tears began to stream down his pale cheeks, and he lowered the rifle slightly, asking me in a broken voice, "Can you save him?" I lied to him with absolute steadfastness and said, "Yes, I can." I told him that I needed to reach inside my leather bag to extract the necessary tools and gears to inject the horse and assist him. What many people do not know is that during that dangerous epoch of Germany's history, some prosthetic makers and veterinarians carried small pistols to protect themselves on isolated roads, or to end the lives of hopeless animals with a merciful round to the skull if an injection was unfeasible. That was not my plan for Brutus, but it was certainly my direct plan for the defiant son. I drew my Luger pistol with a swift motion, aimed it firmly at his chest, and commanded him in a stern tone that brooked no argument, "Drop the rifle, right now." At that moment, Hans appeared to be a completely broken man. He collapsed to his knees, weeping, and muttered that the rifle wasn't even loaded with any ammunition, that he never would have actually shot his parents, and that I could blow his brains out if I wished to end his torment, provided I kept my promise and did everything in my power to save Brutus. I had no intention of shooting him while he was in this pathetic state, but I yelled at him again to get rid of the weapon. When he carelessly tossed the rifle onto the wooden floor of the barn, the unthinkable happened. It turned out that a single, forgotten round was resting inside the chamber due to some unforeseen malfunction. The moment the rifle struck the ground, a thunderous shot went off, piercing the wooden ceiling and sending splinters flying everywhere. Thank God, no one was harmed, but the colossal roar caused the 3 other horses in the barn to erupt into a state of sheer frenzy and panic. They began to whinny loudly and slam their hooves violently against the walls, their frantic sounds blending with the weeping of the Von Heller family, who had thrown themselves to the ground, embracing one another in a sudden scene of tears and familial forgiveness. I realized then that the danger had passed. I retrieved the rifle, hurled it far into the mud outside the barn, and rushed immediately toward Brutus's stall. As for the rest of the events, it can be summarized by saying that the old stallion Brutus was not actually dying. Rather, he was suffering from a severe case of food poisoning brought on by some molded feed. Thanks to some medication and a thorough flushing of his system, I managed to save his life. Before we could even contact the authorities, a local patrol arrived at the scene. It happened that the current deputy sheriff in the district was Hans's childhood friend and old neighbor. Thanks to everyone's desire not to destroy his future and what remained of his life, an agreement was reached not to press any official criminal charges, on the condition that Hans enter a closed rehabilitation facility deep in the northern forest to recover and rid himself of his addiction. Indeed, the young man demonstrated a commitment that astonished us all. 5 years after that fateful night, Hans became the primary manager responsible for running the farm and training the horses, granting his parents the opportunity to enjoy a peaceful and well-deserved retirement. I became the permanent mechanic and veterinarian for the ranch, spending a great deal of time there. I won't say we have become emotionally close, but we are building a strong, enduring friendship. The present, recovered, and clean Hans is the exact same intelligent and gentle youth his parents used to speak of before addiction hijacked his soul. Even though it was the most terrifying night shift of my professional career, an attention-filled moment that nearly cost me my life, I cannot suppress an overwhelming sense of pride. I saved a family from absolute destruction, dragged a man back from the edge of the abyss, and most importantly of all in my eyes, I saved Brutus. That stallion lived a few more years before passing away peacefully in his sleep, and Hans is currently training a small foal he named Little Brutus. I, in all honesty, am pouring my utmost care and medical attention into keeping this little foal thriving. It is a dark tale that began with tears, but it secured a happy ending. And if only all nightmares of the night could conclude in such a way. I worked the late-night guard shifts inside a massive medical repository dedicated to preserving vital specimens and organic organs on the outskirts of the Norwegian city of Oslo. My duties begin in the epoch following midnight, specifically in the year 2022, a time when the corridors are completely devoid of doctors and nurses. I spend the bulk of my time checking the temperatures of giant walk-in freezers, organizing glass storage boxes, and logging serial numbers. It is a job many would view as bleak and deathly, but it grants me my daily bread and covers my financial needs as I near the completion of my university degree in forensic medicine with honors. It is exceedingly rare for this place to witness anything suspicious at night. True, my night shift colleagues possess a few eccentricities, but prolonged isolation breeds that in everyone just the same. I usually arrive at the repository at exactly 11 o'clock at night, the precise hour when the last visitors are expelled and the iron doors are securely locked. I do not know how the breach occurred on that ill-fated night. Perhaps she was hiding inside the changing rooms or blurred into the rows of temporary metal caskets. God alone knows. But the bottom line is that she was a very elderly woman who remained trapped inside the building with us at a time when none but guards and technicians should have been present. One might imagine an old woman like her would wander aimlessly, searching for an exit, weeping over the loss of a loved one, or begging for medication for an illness. But she did nothing of the sort. Instead, she moved through the lobbies of the warehouse with a terrifying silence that mirrored the movements of trained spies, and none of us had the slightest clue of her presence during the first hour of her shift. The first signs of danger arose when a foul odor suddenly emanated from the section reserved for fluid-preserved and refrigerated tissue and organ specimens. I ran alongside my shift colleague, Clara, toward the hall to find out what had caused this sudden decay. Had one of the freezers malfunctioned? Were the autopsy specimens ruined? Yet, nothing that crossed our minds could have prepared us for the spectacle we beheld. The old woman had crawled with her body into an open refrigeration trough filled with crushed ice, a trough Clara was supposed to empty and clean later on. The old woman was thrashing amidst the ice blocks, ripping apart the plastic bags containing marine biology specimens designated for toxicological studies with her bare hands, treating them as though they were enemies threatening her life. We stood watching the scene with a mixture of sheer terror and utter bewilderment. Amazement seized us as she stared with madness into the eye of a massive specimen of a giant sea octopus with long tentacles. It was resting in a preservation solution inside a specialized glass display case, a rare type of specimen imported for marine pollution research. The thick glass of the refrigeration cabin muffled her voice, but we heard her clearly as she screamed into the octopus's face in raspy words. "There you are. I finally found you." She then began trying to tear its head apart with her hands. Since octopus tissue is highly rubbery, tough, and difficult to sever with fingernails, a thoroughly bizarre idea struck the woman. She bent down and began tearing into the octopus's forehead directly with her teeth. However, the surprise lay in the fact that she was wearing a set of false dentures, and with her violent attempts to sever the creature's tentacles, her entire set of dentures became completely stuck and embedded deeply into the gelatinous tissue of the octopus's brow. By that time, a member of the security staff had contacted the police, who had already arrived, but none of the officers dared to intervene immediately. It seemed as though everyone was spellbound, waiting for her next move. Unfortunately, her next move consisted of slamming her shoulder against the glass, shattering the cabin entirely. Shrapnel flew in all directions as she emerged amidst a thoroughly putrid stench wafting from her and the spilled chemical fluids, lunging toward us in a frenzy. At that moment, we realized the odor was not merely chemical. The woman had completely soiled her clothes out of sheer terror and madness. This situation might sound absurdly comical to anyone listening to it now, and the truth of the matter is that it indeed was, right up until that exact second. Suddenly, covered in shards of broken glass, with blood pouring profusely from her wounds, the old woman charged at Clara, tackling her to the ground with terrifying force, screaming in her face, "You tentacled monstrosity! You are the one planting snakes in my body." It seemed that one of her mischievous grandchildren on the internet had shown her some shocking horror clips and marine mutant memes, causing her old mind to fracture and completely detach from reality. The situation ended with the police being forced to use a taser to paralyze her movements and subdue her, but the shocker was that she was entirely unaffected by the jolt. Her slender frame completely withstood the electrical current, perhaps because the officers had utilized a weak charge, assuming she was merely a frail, elderly woman. The old woman spun toward the specimen table, scooped up as many torn pieces of the octopus and chemical solutions as her hands could hold, and pounced on Clara once more. In a matter of seconds, we found ourselves facing a literal nightmare. The woman was attempting to force the intact tentacles of the octopus down Clara's throat by sheer power, all while lashing me with the tail of a dead sea snake that had been used for experiments. Although the scene sounds farcical in the retelling, it was terrifying and deadly at the time. The marine tissue was stuffed with shards of broken glass resulting from the shattering of the cabin, and the old woman was driving the smashed glass directly into Clara's throat, while her own wounds bled over my colleague's face and cut into her flesh. And here came the grand surprise that subsequent investigations unearthed. This old woman was not a woman at all. Rather, he was an old man named Olaf, who had spent his entire life working as a traditional fisherman in coastal villages before completely losing his source of livelihood and facing bankruptcy due to the dominance of commercial trawler fleets, medical warehouses, and corporations that stopped purchasing local catches and replaced them with imports. He had donned the clothes of his late wife, because following his bankruptcy during the period of the Great Marine Depression, his wife had suffered a fatal heart attack brought on by poverty. He began to blame the entire world for her death, directing his greatest fury toward our warehouse specifically. For our facility was the largest client that had severed its contract with him, triggering his ultimate collapse. The incident was truly tragic and horrifying. Clara suffered severe lacerations and acute bleeding in her airways, as well as deep scars covering her body from the shards of broken glass. The repository's management succeeded in enforcing a strict media blackout, preventing any details of the incident from reaching the local newspapers to preserve the facility's reputation, and the psychotic old fisherman was transferred to a secure psychiatric asylum to spend the remainder of his days under guard. I still work at the very same medical repository on the third guard shift, though I hope my stay here will not be prolonged after my fast approach of graduation. Clara has recovered now and returned to her normal life. But all of us in the department conditioned the management and signed a petition asserting our absolute refusal to receive or store any imported octopus specimens in the dissection troughs from this day forward. Perhaps the daytime shifts would have been more peaceful, but my boorish supervisor, whom I repeatedly wished to teach a proper lesson, were it not for my desire to keep my employment record squeaky clean, forced me to take the night shifts exclusively. I was 22 years old, a young guy with 0 university qualifications, who had spent 6 months in a disciplinary boot camp for teenagers and bounced between 3 different foster families. Consequently, I consider myself incredibly lucky just to find a job that ground out a few pennies for me in the late 1980s on the outskirts of the French city of Lyon. There is absolutely nothing entirely legal about the way Mercier ran that decrepit fuel and toll station, but I was no snitch, and Mercier himself has been resting 6 feet under for nearly 2 decades. The ultimate irony is that today, I am involved with his daughter, Helene, and she is carrying my very first child in her womb, so I must pick my words with caution. In fact, Helene is the one sitting right next to me at this moment, nudging me with her elbow to write down this memory for documentation. I am a very kind person in my private life, and I fully plan to officially present her with a wedding ring before a baby is born. At any rate, old Mercier was a greedy man whose face always bore a repulsive, oily gleam, and I thank God that Helene inherited her features and gentle demeanor from her quiet Italian mother rather than her father. We used to receive some thoroughly bizarre specimens of humanity during those dead hours of the night. There was a man who came in regularly just to squander exorbitant amounts of his meager salary on instant scratch-off lottery tickets. I never saw him win a single franc in his entire life. From his appearance and the shabbiness of his clothes, it was glaringly obvious that he lived on the fringes of the slums surrounding the forest. On one of those late-night havens, pity took hold of me, and I told him, "Mate, don't you think it's about time you stop this? I'm genuinely worried about your financial situation." Do you know what his response was? He didn't utter a single word. Instead, he let out a sharp, pure hiss right in my face, like a snake. A hiss so venomous it made me recoil my chair backward. After that incident, I left him to burn by his own choice. Then there was that giant of a man who stood nearly 2¼ meters tall. He would appear at exactly 2 o'clock after midnight with terrifying clockwork precision to purchase only 3 items: a can of energy drink, a pack of dark, unfiltered cigarettes, and a single, massive pickle wrapped in a salty plastic pouch. He looked about 90 years old, as gaunt as dry timber, but there was no way I would ever dare argue with him over his choices, especially after my experience with the hissing customer. As for the third customer, he was a little lad no older than 8. He would show up at exactly 5 o'clock in the morning every Tuesday and Thursday, asking in a broken voice if we sold old comic book volumes of the Asterix and Obelix stories. I would explain to him every single time that we were a fuel and toll station and only sold fuel and canned goods, but he kept returning like clockwork. One day, I went to an old bookstore in the city and bought 6 bound volumes of those stories with my own money. When a little boy came at his next scheduled time, I presented them to him with a smile. The boy looked at the volumes, then screamed an obscene expletive right in my face, hurled the books violently against the cabin wall, and bolted back into the darkness. To this day, I haven't the faintest clue what I did wrong by him, and I never saw him again after that night, which was a massive relief to me. Yet, all those eccentricities were merely a pale prelude to the actual nightmare that unfolded on a foggy November night. I was standing behind the glass payment counter, busy filling out the logbooks, when the silence of the place was pierced by a booming, deep, and thoroughly posh voice. It demanded explicitly that I cook up a smoked sausage sandwich immediately, because the sandwiches displayed in the rotating warmer looked charred and as disgusting as corpses. I glanced at the machine, and his words were spot on. Those sausages had been spinning in there for at least 3 days, knowing how stingy Mercier was, so prepping a fresh batch was hardly an insurmountable task. The only problem? I couldn't see a soul in the shop. The voice was incredibly close and urgent, shouting again. "Move your backside, guard. I don't have all night to waste here." I bent my body over the high wooden counter to investigate the blind spot beneath the glass. And there I beheld a short-statured man, a dwarf, standing completely pressed against the wood, to the point where his forehead nearly touched the bottom ledge. I admitted to myself that I felt embarrassed because his position had made him impossible to see from behind the counter. I apologized to him in an overly polite manner, saying, "I am terribly sorry, sir. I didn't realize you were a person of short stature." The man let out a sharp exhale and appeared thoroughly vexed, stating that these modern euphemisms made him sick to his stomach. In a stupid attempt of mine to fix the situation, I stammered, "My apologies again. I didn't notice you were a dwarf." At that exact moment, I saw his face turn crimson with rage and bitterness, and I knew I had botched it completely. My mind scrambled through my shallow memory for the correct terminology used in that era, when medical distinctions weren't widely known to the public, and he sharply explained to me that he suffered from a specific growth disorder that demanded respect. I had absolutely no intention of causing offense. During my time in the disciplinary camp, I had been attacked with a burning acid substance that left one side of my face severely scarred and rendered me blind in my left eye. Thus, I was the last person who would ever mock the physical differences of others. I told him in a calm tone that I would cook the absolute best sausage sandwich for him, and I asked him to accompany me to the self-cooking station in the corner of the cabin so we could supervise its grilling together. Somehow, this offer succeeded in igniting his rage into absolute madness all over again. He started screaming in my face, delivering a lecture that resembled a classical theatrical monologue, asserting that he was the customer and shouldn't have to budge from his spot, and that my job was to go prepare the food and dress it with all the toppings without discussion. In reality, the machine was strictly self-service, but I chose to play it safe and told him with a fake smile that I would fetch it for him immediately. The short man replied in a dry, rigid tone, "It's too late now. You've ruined everything, and it's time to pay the price." Amidst my absolute astonishment, I saw the short man begin to stretch and rise. Yes, he was slowly ascending until he reached a full height of 1 meter and 80 centimeters. At that very instant, he plunged his hand beneath his long, draped coat and pulled out a sawed-off shotgun. He leveled the weapon right at the center of my chest and said coldly, "If you try to touch the panic button under your foot, I'll blast a hole in your chest the size of that sausage sandwich you were too lazy to cook." To hell with Mercier, and to hell with the station. I was not about to die for a job that paid me crumbs and forced me to stay up 5 nights a week. I looked at the man who had suddenly transformed into a heavily armed giant and said to him calmly, "Keep your cool, mate. All the money is yours." I emptied the entire contents of the cash drawer for him into a cloth bag he produced from his pocket. He flashed me a sly, vindictive smirk, then turned to walk out of the glass door with confident strides. But he didn't just leave quietly. Right before taking his final step outside, he spun around and fired a blast from his shotgun directly at the rotating sausage machine, blowing it into flying metallic shards that filled the air with smoke and left my ears ringing with a sharp, continuous electrical buzz. I hit the emergency button and contacted the police the second he departed. When the investigation got underway, we uncovered a series of shocking facts. First, old Mercier was so tight-fisted that he had installed a fake outdoor security camera made of cheap plastic to trick thieves. Consequently, we didn't have a single frame of the criminal as he exited or boarded a vehicle. Second, the indoor camera was functioning, and upon reviewing the tape, the clever trick was revealed. The man had been crouching entirely on his knees atop custom-made, professionally padded boots designed to make him appear extremely short. He had practiced this stance to ensure his actual legs vanished behind the blind spot of the counter. This perfectly explained his absolute refusal to accompany me to the sausage machine, as his movement would have instantly exposed his actual height. The hilarious part was that this fake dwarf was wanted in several armed robbery cases in neighboring districts, and he had never once fired a shot in any previous crime. Do you know what caught him? his showy stunt shot at the sausage machine. Forensic experts managed to trace the ballistic projectile and match it to a rifle registered under its original owner's name, and he was arrested within days. Given his lengthy prior record, I am entirely confident he will spend the rest of his days behind the iron bars of a penitentiary. As for me, I received a severe tongue-lashing and insult from Mercier because he considered me a coward for handing over the cash instead of using the wooden baseball bat hanging under the table to confront a shotgun. I resigned from the job that very instant and retook control of my life. I returned to night school and eventually earned my degree. Years later, I met the woman whose beauty and serenity stole my heart. I didn't know at the time that she was the daughter of Mercier himself, and that she detested his greed and temperament far more than I ever did. Our very first dates were built on shared laughter and mutual relief after learning of his passing. I might come across as harsh to some, but those people didn't know the nature of that man. He would have preferred me to catch a bullet to the chest rather than lose 200 francs from his cash box. To hell with Mercier, and to hell with the fake dwarf. I work now in a prestigious financial sector. My life has become wonderful and stable, and this is my story with a bunch of weirdos, one of whom nearly ended my existence in a passing moment of madness.